Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to Staking Our Claim, Charting a Path for the Realizing the Right to Housing for Women and Gender Diverse People. My name is Erin Day, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology here at Wilfrid Laurier University. Thank you to everyone in the room here for joining in person, and for everybody virtually, hello and welcome. I'm going to start things off by turning things over to Gwanagu Bonnie Whitlow, Indigenous Special Project Officer for the Office of Indigenous Initiatives, to provide the opening address.
Sego sewa gwego. Hello everyone. Gwanagu ni yats. My Yungohui name is Gwanagu. My English name is Bonnie Whitlow. Swego ni dwegenu. I'm from Six Nations. Wakskarlewege. I'm Bear Clan. Ganyanke hagani wagun kunjodu. A lot of times people will ask us to come in and deliver a Thanksgiving address for a wide variety of openings, and sometimes they refer to it as a blessing or a prayer, but that is not how I refer to it at all. It is a reflection back to an agreement we made as human beings when, at the point of creation, when the planet Earth was seeded with life. We agreed to be thankful to all of the things in the natural world. And that was going to be our payment for all of the work that's done to sustain the human being. It's a practice that we continue to do daily, over and over again, and it's called the Ohondogaliwadekwa, which means the first order of business. But what it really is our first priority as human beings. And we take every time 3 or more people are gathered together, we take that first moment to set our minds at ease and to bring our minds together as one and to be thankful in a way that I've come to think of as guided meditation. But recognizing that you don't speak Ganyangeha, you might get lost a little bit, so I try to bounce back and forth between Ganyangeha and English in order to hopefully carry you along and put those pictures in your head, and so that in that way all of us together can be responsible for putting this through together. So the first part is just Ganjokwa, Sewaduhusios, Ginigerliwes, the Tidawanulados, Nesungwaidisum, Ahandagerliwadekwa, Idawawano Hetste. So that first little section is just a call out to all of us who are gathered here together today, including those online, wherever the online camera is pointing at, that all of us together would take a moment to set all of our other thoughts and ideas aside, and that we would listen very closely as we put the words through together. Ona nua nanchi da date ni ngulaerli te giohunjade dano de atinulados a guego nene ohunjagesu. De atinulados ne chisego yunki at the gehas, dano yunki at the nutna, geniot chila werlo, dano logo dago nesungwaidizo. De atinulados ne chisego yunki at the nutna, geniot g sagorli nayani, giodasawa, giohunjade. Negadi at nue, idawatkawe, neganula dunsulai, toni unduhak, ne ungwatnigorla. So with that first one, I just ask us to all take our minds and to think towards and point in the direction of the earth, all of those earthbound entities that take care of us. So all of those things from, and I didn't say this, but culturally we refer to the entirety of the natural world, all of the growing things, all of the green growing things and the grasses and the medicines and the trees, the birds, all of those things. All the animals, all the insects, we say thank you to them because they continue to work to support our lives, and that we have to remember as human beings that we are the most vulnerable, that we are absolutely dependent on everything in the natural world, and the natural world would flourish just fine without us. So just putting that into our minds, the end section of it says that we would all come together as one in our minds, and that we would take that gift and we would leave it before all of those beings as thanks. Ona nua nanchi da badai ni ngorla erite jit galuhiade da no de tinorlado sa guego ne galuhigeso de tinorlados ne chisego yunkia de hasta no yunkia de nutna gini ot gilo godagwa ne sangwai dizon jijo daso ai jiu hanjade de tinorlados ne chisego yunkia de nutna gini ot chi sagali nayani ne gadi nuwe ai da wat kawe ne ganola dun sulai toni unduhak ne ungwat ni gorla. So with that, when I asked us to take our minds and turn towards the skies this time, to all of those sort of like life forces that together are part of this like the structure of the world, and that all of those things continue to watch over us and to care for us. As he had, there's this section in it that says that like he bundled these ideas or this request together, and that he, like in a very benevolent way, gave this sort of like contract. I don't know if that's the wrong word, but he left that for each of the beings, and they all accepted that they would continue to do that work for the human beings. Onanua isinak galuhyadi nanchi da badai ni go layerlite dano ayawes gia had the one any harlot ne jinue told that they knocked lagwani ne sangwai dizo ayawes gi lotundes ne gigo handagali bedekwa danulo der yandele gigan adihonjade guego ne lodina shuni sego de tinorlados giniot gi logo dagwa ne gi sego de wasoles giniongoli hodos danu neji sego de watsta ne ungowana ne gadi hnewe de watkawe ne ganola dusulai toni undu hak ne ungwani gola. So with that one, I asked us to take our minds this time and to turn towards the other side of the skies, to the place where he chose his home, and that it's hopeful that our words would reach his ears and that he would hear that the Haudenosaunee, the original beings, that we still follow our traditional teachings, and that we still use our original language, and that we still remember to be thankful to all of those things. And I didn't say it, and usually I do say it, but ayar like ji sego sungonalunkwa. It would appear that he still loves us because all of those things that were put in place here upon the earth continue to do the work that they had agreed to. Onanua handagali wedekwa wendawa no het stay do get a tano sun get ni gorha jiza white that's jiza wagodago dononeto. And that last one is just I always call it a disclaimer, and it's really I say I did the best that I was able to in order to fulfill my responsibility, but that if I had forgotten something or if I made a mistake, that maybe somebody in this room was able to correct it in their mind, and in that way all of us together were able to come to fulfill our duty. So Nyawa, thank you for inviting us in, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Gwanagu. I'd now like to invite Dr. Tony Rougeau, the Assistant Vice President of Campus Operations, to welcome you to Laurier Brantford.
Good evening, everyone. As mentioned, I am Tony Rougeau. I'm the Interim Senior Executive Officer of the Brantford campus at the moment as well, just because everyone should have at least two different focuses in their careers. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you here, both virtually and in person. It's wonderful to see the great turnout. Wilfrid Laurier University's Brantford campus, it's known for its high level of community integration, its commitment to creating a more just world. Before COVID-19 became part of our lives, we hosted, on average, sometimes a lot more, 150 events per year, which is quite a bit. When you think about all the work that goes into that, the commitment of our faculty and staff and students to do that. We've been very open to public engagement, and that just demonstrates that. I'm pleased to see more of this activity returning for myself, and I'm sure for many of you. It's nice to have our social interaction with each other and really have the kind of experience that's set out for tonight. So events like this lecture provide many benefits, including free and accessible learning opportunities, community engagement, inspire discourse around compelling and important issues of the day, and I think this issue is definitely a compelling issue of the day. Simply put, events like this exemplify what our campus is all about. Housing is an issue that is top of mind across the country right now. It's pretty much every day that I hear some story about housing concerns in every form. But housing, as it's going to be discussed this evening, is even more important. We're talking about housing inequality experienced by women and gender diverse people, and in particular, Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited people. So my thanks to all of you for joining us for what promises to be a very thought-provoking evening. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Dr. Day.
Thank you, Dr. Rougeau. Before I introduce our speakers for the evening, I want to take this opportunity to thank the team who made this evening happen. A big thank you to Heidi Northwood and the Vice President Academic Office, as well as Dr. Rougeau and the Laurier Brantford Grants Program for their financial support of this event. I'd also like to thank the co-sponsors of the event, the Office of Indigenous Initiatives and CRISP for their support. I'd like to thank Pink's Productions for the folks of you at home who are seeing this seamless virtual experience right now. For Tracy Woodford for her help, and I would like to extend a special thank you to Dr. Samantha Henderson for lending her expertise and limited time to this event. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for the evening. Dr. Kaitlin Schwan is the Executive Director of the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network and a Senior Researcher at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. She teaches social policy at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Social Work, where she is appointed Assistant Professor by status. She is the former Senior Researcher for the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing and Director of Research for The Shift. Dr. Schwan uses her research to build bridges between evidence, advocacy, policy, and lived expertise to advance housing justice. Marie McGregor Pitawanakwat is an Anishinaabe Kwe from Daganing, Wikwamikong on Manitoulin Island in northeastern Ontario. She is the co-chair of the National Indigenous Feminist Housing Working Group and co-chair of the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. Marie's missions are to share information and knowledge about secure Indigenous land tenure and to develop training programs for Indigenous women and gender diverse people to build their own homes. It is with great pleasure that I turn it over to Dr. Schwan, who will be the first speaker for the evening.
Ooh, hi everyone. It is so wonderful to be here. I have been working with Dr. Day collaboratively for many years, and it's just a dream to be here talking about kind of some work that's incredibly important to both of us and to many of you in the room. We're going to be talking about the right to housing and our efforts to claim it in Canada, specifically for women and gender diverse folks. And as was mentioned, we're in a really difficult moment right now in Canada with respect to housing. We see huge housing need, huge housing inequality, major spikes in evictions. Many of you will have seen encampments that have grown in your communities for the first time. You know, we're 5 years into a 10-year national housing strategy, but we're really not seeing decreases in homelessness. So in that context, I often think about, okay, what brings me hope? And one of the things that I think is incredibly powerfully happening right now is grassroots communities across Canada claiming their right to housing, and Canada actually establishing for the first time a piece of legislation called the National Housing Strategy Act that establishes housing as a human right based in international human rights law, and it's like a very high standard. So what we're hoping to do, and it's totally an honor to be here with my colleague Marie, who is brilliant, we're hoping that we can get you kind of inspired about what the right to housing is, how to claim it in Canada, what we've been doing with respect to women and gender diverse folks experiencing housing need and homelessness. And just start you thinking about what this means for your communities, for your advocacy or your activism. As we get started, I want to kind of take a temperature check in the room. How many folks here feel that housing is a human right? Okay, so for folks online, we're seeing almost all the hands, or maybe all the hands. How many people feel like you can explain what that means in the law? Okay, we have a couple of hands, which is great. Maybe we'll call on you. But for folks online, so many of us have this deep belief that housing is a human right, but we don't necessarily know what that means in law or how to claim it. So that's kind of where I want to start. And to ground the conversation, let's really think about what human rights are about. When we're talking about human rights, if you ask yourself what they're about, their essence is about preserving dignity. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the basis of all human rights, really recognizes in its preamble that the inherent dignity and equal rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, of justice, and peace in the world. So the thing that mobilizes us when we do human rights advocacy is that we are daring to insist on a society in which we are equal in dignity, in rights, where we have equal worth. So however far we are from that at any point in time, we're always positing that as a legitimate vision, not as a utopian one. And we're able to posit it as a legitimate vision because we understand that human rights impose legal obligations on governments to act. So we can demand accountability through the courts and through human rights accountability mechanisms to ensure that those rights are being upheld and enforced. So really what human rights does is turn something like the Sustainable Development Goals from like a policy aspiration and into something that we're actually going to hold governments accountable to do. And ultimately, what we're talking about here is change and action. It involves individuals and groups identifying how their human rights have been violated and then going to bodies that are able to remedy those issues. So actors who have legal obligations towards rights holders in this area. And ultimately, it clarifies who is responsible to who. Human rights are establishing that governments are accountable to rights holders. And it really, in a beautiful way, human rights puts rights holders in the center, both in terms of folks' ability to articulate what the human rights violations are that they've experienced, but also what does a human right mean? What does the right to housing mean? And I would suggest to us that there's no one who's better positioned to articulate what the right to housing means than someone who is living in homelessness. At a policy level and a legislative level, what's also transformational about human rights is it's not about individual issues, it's about identifying systemic issues and then looking for systemic solutions. So when tonight we're talking about housing and homelessness, what does it really mean to see this as a human rights issue? What does the law say? So in international human rights law, and if you get a chance, I would really suggest looking into this because it's really rich and exciting. The standards are incredibly high in international human rights law with respect to the right to housing. Homelessness is considered what's called a prima facie violation of the right to housing, and it also violates a number of other rights, including the right to life and the right to health. And there are these very high obligations for government. So, for example, homelessness has to be treated with the highest urgency. So it's not just a social problem or a policy option that cities or federal, provincial, territorial governments can look at. It's actually a matter of life and death, and it has to be responded to in that way. Governments have an obligation to adopt strategies to eliminate homelessness with really specific targets and timelines. So many countries around the world do not obviously have these strategies, don't have these timelines, and it prevents them from being able to track their progress towards the progressive realization of that right. A third piece that's really important for us here in Canada too is under international human rights law, it's not permissible to actually evict someone into homelessness. That's considered a violation of their human rights. But of course, we do this all the time in our country. And finally, I'll just mention that governments also have an obligation to ensure that the private sector is acting in alignment with their human rights obligations. So, as all of you will know, we have huge, big corporate capital involved in housing, that housing is increasingly positioned as a tool for wealth generation and investment rather than as a social good and a human right. So it's up to governments to ensure that private actors are acting in alignment with their human rights obligations as well. So the good news for us, and I mentioned this act is really cool. The National Housing Strategy Act. We adopted this in 2019. It's the first time in federal legislation where we have said housing is a human right. We have a social and economic right to it. And it's based in international human rights law. So some of these standards that I just mentioned are actually domesticated in this legislation. And we have an accountability system through this. So we've adopted a system where we have what's called the Federal Housing Advocate. She is essentially a watchdog on the right to housing in Canada and the extent to which the government is meeting its human rights obligations. And so for the first time, people are able to actually articulate human rights violations in the area of housing, bring it to the advocate, she reviews it. The National Housing Council is also a secondary body that looks at human rights issues, and then recommendations are made to the Minister of Housing, who has to respond within 120 days. So this is an incredible piece of legislation that I am not sure the federal government understood when they established it, how powerful it can be, how unique it is in the world. So it's up to us at this moment to really be using this legislation to be advancing the right to housing. And so this is what Marie and I are here to talk about, kind of how we've been doing that work. I'm going to talk about this first claim that the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network developed. And kind of briefly to give you a sense of how we developed it, we're an organization that's focused on preventing and ending homelessness for women and gender diverse folks across the country, really focused on putting folks with lived expertise at the center of that work. So we developed a team of about 25 people from across country, a majority of which had lived experience of homelessness, to identify what we see as the key human rights violations that are happening for marginalized women and gender diverse people. Did a lot of collaborative writing, a lot of time on Zoom, a lot of time on every kind of possible device, really, and drafted this very large human rights claim that we submitted to the Federal Housing Advocate. So what I'm going to do is kind of go through some of the issues that we articulated and give you a sense of kind of where we go from here. So our claim is really based on the central argument that the housing system we currently live in has a discriminatory impact on marginalized women and gender diverse people, that we are making intentional policy choices that are resulting in systemic inequality for women and gender diverse people who are in core housing need, single moms, folks with disabilities, and other marginalized groups. And that because of these policy choices, we're actually manufacturing a human rights crisis. And for us, that language of manufacturing was really, really important. And so what we're articulating is this violates our right to equality, but it also violates our right to housing. under the National Housing Strategy Act and also a range of other international treaties that Canada has signed on to. So it's not just that this is a problem or it's not fair or it's a policy issue. The articulation here is that this is a human rights issue and that this is a human rights crisis. And the claim for us was kind of not just about naming those human rights violations, but claiming like a space of power and agency for marginalized women and gender diverse people who are being excluded in the housing system. So a powerful statement that I wanted to highlight for you all tonight from the claim is, we see no future for ourselves in the current housing regime. While our present circumstances have been determined for us, the future is not yet decided. We offer this claim as part of our efforts to author a future for ourselves, our communities, and our planet, through which housing is a tool for inclusion, equity, dignity, and interdependence. And I really love this language because it positions the human right to housing as central to agency and control over our own lives. So I'm gonna highlight kind of 4 issues that came up in the claim we wrote, but I would encourage you, if you get a chance, go onto our website. It's womenshomelessness.ca. Look at the claim because it's actually so beautifully written and took many, many, many months with 25 people working on it to develop it. So first of all, what we are seeing at a national level is really problematic systemic inequities in funding in the emergency shelter system. So if you see in the graph here, these are kind of where we're allocating funding to shelter beds across Canada. And what you'll see is that 68% of funding goes to men or co-ed shelters, and 13% goes to women-specific shelters. We know that many women and gender diverse folks are going to avoid co-ed shelters due to experiences of harassment and violence within them. And so we have built kind of a system around largely a male-centered emergency shelter system. And there was a great study done by Statistics Canada a couple of years ago that looked in a single night how many women and children are returning away at violence against women shelters. And it's about 1,000. So every night in Canada, about 1,000 women and children go to a violence against women shelter. They've probably used all the resources they've had, relied on all the friends they have, used all the money they have, and they get there and there isn't space for them. And many of those folks will return to abusive situations. So the circumstances are really severe. And as you see here with these quotes, we did the largest study on women's homelessness a couple of years ago in Canada. And we asked women, okay, what happened when you were turned away from a shelter? And so these are some of the responses. Slept outside or slept with a man for a place. Stayed awake all night looking for a friend to take me in usually. I slept outside, and when I did, the police arrested me and stole my personal belongings. Begged a friend to let me stay with him. In exchange, I cleaned his apartment. Stayed in an abusive situation with my dog and my kid. So this is a clear threat to life for many women and children across Canada. And you can see very clearly the ways in which the inequity in funding are resulting in tremendous harm for women and gender diverse folks across the country. The second thing we looked at was the National Housing Strategy. So very big deal for folks who may not know. 5 years ago, we established a National Housing Strategy for the first time in Canada, 10-year strategy, $72 billion. It was kind of this big deal of the federal government getting back in the housing game after having divested really significantly for many years. So we did a gendered analysis of the National Housing Strategy policy and had a look at it. And what we know from other research is that as a population, women and gender diverse folks are more likely to be in core housing need and more likely to be in deeper forms of core poverty. But what we're seeing when we look at the National Housing Strategy is they're actually the least likely to benefit from some of these programs. So I'll give you an example because this infographic might not make perfect sense to you. So with our national survey, we looked at, okay, what is the depth of poverty for women and gender diverse people experiencing homelessness across the country? And we asked women about their most recent housing. And many of them talked about, they had no money to pay for housing, or pay for anything after they had paid for housing. Only 14% were able to cover basic necessities. On average, people were either on social assistance and also had 3 other kind of means to try to patch together finances to make ends meet. And about a third were accumulating debt each month. And as was evidenced in our survey, many of them ended up on the street. So we think about this population, and then we think about, okay, what are we doing in the National Housing Strategy? And we can look at something like the Rental Construction Financing Initiative. That's the one at the bottom here. This is where we're spending the most money. 40% of the National Housing Strategy funds are going here. And what it is only 20% of the units in these buildings need to be considered affordable. They only need to be affordable for 10 years, and then they can go back to market rent. And affordable is considered 30% of the median total income for families in the area. So essentially what that means is the rent is really tied to the income of the neighborhood. But as we know, that does not predict whether people living in poverty are able to pay. And so what this means is many of the units that are being created are $1,000 and up, completely inaccessible for the women and gender diverse folks that we're talking about who are in deep core housing need, who are living on the street, who are experiencing violence every day, trying to navigate deep poverty. And so the issue is that our investments really aren't prioritizing those most in need. And as a result, it's having a knock-on discriminatory impact for women and gender diverse people, especially racialized, newcomer, Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited folks. Oh, yep, perfect. The third issue I wanted to highlight is, one of the things that we've done in Canada over the last many years is really focus on chronic homelessness in policy. So a lot of our investments go to chronic homelessness, a lot of our targets are in that area, and it's excellent. We should be doing that for sure. But the challenge is the way we define that is 6 months unsheltered on the street. And for folks who are 6 months unsheltered on the street, you are prioritized for getting access to housing and other kinds of supports. But what we know is that women and gender diverse people's experiences of homelessness is very unique, and it's much more likely to be what we call hidden homelessness. So you see in this infographic, in the middle is kind of when we think about homelessness, we imagine a person on the street visibly homeless. But women's experiences of homelessness, because they're so often tied to experiences of violence, of caregiving of children, and also just deep core poverty, it's much more likely to be in situations of overcrowding, in chronic abuse, couch surfing, kind of remaining in these situations where their homelessness isn't visible in the way that men's homelessness is much more likely to be. And so if you are a woman that can't get out of an abusive situation, you've been in it for many, many years, you're there with your children, you are not going to be considered chronically homeless under our definition. You won't be necessarily prioritized for housing for yourself or your children. And same with folks who are couch surfing. You don't, so we have a situation where the kind of invisibilized nature of women's homelessness is reinscribed through policy because we don't have a definition of homelessness that captures these kinds of homelessness that are happening in very gendered ways. And so what that means is we continue to kind of fail women and gender diverse people that are in this situation. And finally, I wanted to highlight that, a rights-based approach to housing really means that we need an intersectionally gendered approach in terms of how we design policy and practices. So we have many instances, for example, where women are in a kind of catch-22 situation of having to try to choose between trying to remain with their children or try to get social housing, or if they get social housing, they're not able to reconnect with their children because they need to have a bedroom for that child. And so one of the kind of findings from our national survey that I wanted to highlight that was really interesting and important is that we asked participants, you know, okay, how did you lose your most recent housing? And we gave them a ton of potential answers, right? Eviction, health crisis, loss of job, change in family, like a whole range of things. But the number one response, as you see here, was a breakup. So women and gender diverse folks, the pathway into homelessness, the number one pathway across Canada, combined with other factors, is actually a breakup. And so what this means is that in order for women and gender diverse people to remain in housing, they actually have to remain in personal, romantic, sexual relationships. That security of tenure for a huge segment of the population depends on whether they continue to remain in these relationships. And so this is a huge, huge right to housing issue because security of tenure is totally central to what we see as the human right to housing. And the effect of what is happening, this kind of dependence, is we're seeing mass informal evictions of women and gender diverse people across the country. And you know, under the right to housing, it's a violation, a human rights violation to evict people into homelessness, but this is what is happening informally for women and gender diverse folks across the country all the time. So where do we go from here? Just very briefly, we have this claim. It's currently being reviewed by the Federal Housing Advocate. And what we're going to be doing over the next 6 months is national consultations with women and gender diverse folks experiencing homelessness on their human rights violations. So if anyone in the room or anyone online who's listening wants to engage, I would just really encourage you to connect with us as we do this. Part of our intent is to build up a body of evidence of what these human rights violations look like on the ground, but then also to help folks like yourselves and others support, like for us to support you to develop your own claims as well. So there's going to be a huge range of diverse housing rights violations that communities are experiencing. So part of our hope is also to support groups to articulate that, and also to use these claims in your own local efforts. Part of what we do is try to provide information and materials and tools for people about what this new legislation is and what it means, and kind of create pathways for accountability and to engage stakeholders in that work. And I wanted to just share a couple of images. Marie's in these. This is when we launched our claim. We launched our claim at Parliament in June of last year. And we subsequently did a national symposium on the right to housing where women and gender diverse folks who had experienced homelessness came together and spoke to the Federal Housing Advocate about their experiences. And we had one of these great illustrators who worked with us on this. But I guess the last message I want to leave with you is, like, the right to housing it's new in Canada. It's really exciting, but it's totally critical that we understand that it's owned by people, that it's not owned by government, that there are established pathways through which we can hold governments to accountable through this new legislation, but that the power rests with the people in doing this work. And so I would just encourage all of you to start thinking about the work you do in a rights-based way. Start thinking about what human rights violations are happening in the housing you're living in, around you, in your communities. And yeah, I'll leave it at that, and please reach out. You'll have my contact. Yeah, great. I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Marie. Thank you so much.
Bonjour. Wachier. Marie McGregor Pitawanakwat. Do Gan Kwen Dao, Anishinaabe Kwen Dao. My name is Marie McGregor Pitawanakwat. I'm a Anishinaabe Kwe, which is our name for ourselves as women. Do Gan Kwe also means woman from South Bay, which is the English name for Doganing. Manitoulin Island, northeastern Ontario. I'm happy that you're here today to listen to us. I hope that we can help you out. So I have a PowerPoint presentation that I need to, there we go. It's called Staking Our Claim, the Right to Housing. Part of it is in Anishinaabemowin, and I'll explain the English parts of that as I go along, because one of my missions in life is to myself learn our language again, but also help others learn. It's part of the reconciliation part of truth and reconciliation. So this is called Staking Our Claim, the Right to Housing. The subtitle is Charting a Path. How do we realize the right to housing for Indigenous women and gender diverse people? And that's what we are aiming to do, is to see our way to getting that done. What I want to make reference to is where does our human rights come from, us, Anishinaabeg? And it comes from the teachings that were given to us and about how we were placed here and what we were provided with and what our responsibilities were and are and what our rights were and are. So the heading here is Anishinaabe Ake, which means original people's land. And the further part of the teaching talks about Anishinaabe Ake is all of Turtle Island, from North America to Central America to South America. And it includes many thousands of indigenous nations from one end to the other. But in my case, I can only speak about Anishinaabeg, which is who I am. So that second phrase, Kinagego Mampi Anishinaabe Ake. So we were taught that all of this land that we're on is Anishinaabe land. And if I can make reference to the size of that land, 9,985,000 square kilometers of land from coast to coast to coast. Second largest landmass in the world. Now think of the number 100. Imagine a rectangle with 100 squares on it. That's that 9,985,000 square kilometers of land. Now imagine one of those squares, 1 out of 100. Now imagine 1/3 of one of those squares. 1/3 of one of those squares is all that's left to us, and it's called Indian Reserve Land. And the legal title to that Indian Reserve Land is held by the Crown. What does that mean? It means that Indians living on Indian reserves do not even own our own land. And in order to live on an Indian reserve, you need a certificate of possession, which is quasi-ownership. So in effect, it's not even full ownership. So how did that happen? It happened because of the Indian Act and the treaties. So here's what I want to say about that. If the treaties' terms are not enforced, then they become null and void. So that means that 99.75% of all that land is still ours. Anyway, just a little thought. The next phrase here is Meuja Meuja, which means a long time ago. Long, 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 long time ago. Part of our creation story has to do with what we call Shkakamekwe, which means Mother Earth. And I know that the scientists have determined that Earth itself is a living, organic, breathing entity. And we regard that living, breathing entity as female, so we call her Shkakamekwe. And the next phrase there, Kejemenado Giminagome Ake Nibe Shkude Minwa Bagadan Namowin. So Kejemenado, the great creator, gave us the land, the water, you see that here. That's Manitou River, by the way, on Manitoulin Island, near Tekama. Shkude is the fire, and then Bagadanamuin is the air. So those 4 things were given to us. The next title here is Kwewok, and all I can speak to you about is my lived experience as an Anishinaabe Kwe, a woman. Kich aje guna kwewok gioje gewok, wigwaman gioje gewok. So what this means is that a long, long time ago, women, indigenous women, had the role, the duty, and the responsibility to provide the housing for ourselves. So we did that. So if you look at all of those black and white historical photos of women putting together wigwams, women setting up the teepees and building homes, that was our role. And we have lost that role, and we need to take it back. Endayong, this word means our home. Anishinaabe, ake endayong. Wabanong, jaonong, epingishmok giwednong. Again, Anishinaabe ake, Anishinaabe land is our home. So again, I make reference to that 99.75% of the landmass that is now called Canada. That's our home. Wabanong is the east. That's where the sun comes up. Jaonong is south. That's where the energy of youth is. Epingishmok is where the sun goes down. That's where you look towards the sunset of your life. Giwednong is what we call the white eyebrow society, the wisdom of the north, the frost and the cold and the wind and the ice, all of those Arctic things are in Kiwednong and where the true knowledge resides. Again, Meoja, a long, 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 long time ago. Where does the human right to housing come from for indigenous people? Since time immemorial that we have lived here, North, Central, and South America. And I'd like to lean on the archaeologists a little bit. So their estimates put it at 35,000 to 50,000 years before present, which is the BP. You add that to the creation knowledge held by indigenous nations from one end of the continent to the other. They all say that we were created and placed here. And I can't talk about the right to housing without looking back at our history and how it was we came to be dispossessed from our homelands. So basically, the doctrine of discovery has been debunked. And our creation knowledge talks about indigenous peoples were placed on Great Turtle Island. Again, reference to that creation knowledge that's held by thousands of indigenous nations from one end of North America to the south. And we believe that we did not migrate across the Bering Strait, contrary to what the archaeologists say. I agree that people moved back and forth from the Americas across the oceans and back. But to say that we came from Asia to here, no, we originated here. Again, with reference to why there's homelessness and why we have the right to housing, we need to look back at that history to see how that happened. And so here's another one. Terra nullius has also been debunked. So terra nullius means empty land. And for us, the land was not empty. Some estimates put our entire numbers in pre-contact times at 162 million people. But I think it was way more than that, but there's no evidence to confirm it. But that's the best written evidence to say how many indigenous peoples there were in North, Central, and South America. And also, there were hundreds of indigenous nations in pre-contact Americas. So think of hundreds in Canada, hundreds in now the United States, and hundreds in South America. I call this title Civilizations because one of the things that happens with murdered and missing indigenous women and girls, with the mistreatment of indigenous peoples in the medical care system, and with homelessness and lack of adequate housing, precarious housing, is that we were not seen as human beings. So if you're not a human being, you're not a civilization. But I'm putting that word civilizations right at the top. And I want to say that thousands of indigenous languages existed in pre-contact Americas, which are hallmarks of civilization. There were many examples of architectural diversity. One thing I read somewhere was that the most perfect house in the world is an Inuit person wearing fur from head to toe. And that person wearing that sealskin and whatever other animal's fur was the most perfect house, because he or she wearing that could go anywhere in the frozen Arctic and survive, including living in the igloo. So from there to teepees, to wigwams, to longhouses, to apartment buildings, high buildings, skyscrapers, temple mounds, all kinds of examples of architectural diversity in the Americas. That says to me that there were all kinds of civilizations here pre-contact. And so in the image you have there in front of you is Anishinaabe words for those items that are there. Muzoyan sabap, which is moose hide rope. And then the others is the materials that go into working with crafts. So we're working at recovering our languages, and in this case, the writing. Again, civilizations. There were many belief systems and many varieties of political systems. So one example of that would be the little purple circle at the small part there. You're yourself, you're part of a family, you're part of a clan, you're part of a community. And then the blue one there is you're part of all of human beings' collectivity. You're part of the collection of human beings that inhabit Mother Earth, and also part of the cosmos. So the reason I use the circle is they're inclusive. They capture, they encompass. And one is part of the other, not separated. And again, civilizations, I'm talking about how did it happen that indigenous people become homeless in our own homelands? How did it happen that 4 women were murdered and thrown into a dump in Winnipeg? It's because we were not regarded as being civilized. So in pre-contact times, there were sophisticated economic systems, trade routes, and various forms of currency. If you think about Highway I-95 stretching from Sault Ste. Marie all the way to the end where Florida ends, that was built on trade routes used by indigenous peoples in pre-contact times. So our trading systems went from one end to the other. And I can't talk about Central or South America. I'm not familiar with that, but I remember hearing stories about people trading in all the way from Sault Ste. Marie down south to Florida and back and all places in between. And again, part of the idea of being civilized human beings is that our people had workable education systems, practiced horticulture, practiced agriculture, permaculture, harvesting. So we knew how to live with the land, to accept the gifts that the Creator gave us. The trees, the plants, the roots, the shrubs, the fish, the birds, the animals that sacrifice themselves to us for our food. And at the center there you'll see the learner is learning all of those things about how to survive. And again, contributions to food diversity using travel and transportation systems. I'm not so sure about the milk and cheese. I don't think we did milk and cheese. But all the others, yes, tomatoes, potatoes, eggs, strawberries. Strawberries, odemanan. The strawberry is shaped like a heart. The word for heart is de, odemin, one strawberry. Odemanan, strawberries. So it's the fruit that's in the shape of the heart. And again, our people developed defense systems. Those 5 straight rectangular things there represent the palisade, which was the fence work around our homes, our communities, our villages, our towns. and metallurgy, copper, for example, and stories about silver and gold being carted away from Central and South America by the shiploads. And that silver and gold financed the Spanish government in the 1500s. That was indigenous gold, indigenous silver. And even today, we use copper as a metal in everyday life. And you'll see the water walkers carrying little copper containers to carry the water in. So we did have metallurgy. So those words there, biabik is metal, ishkode is fire, bish is water. I don't know about metallurgy for copper, but to me those are the basic ingredients and what happens to them, and you end up with the end product. Changes. Again, talking about how did indigenous people get to be homeless in our own homeland. It didn't just happen overnight, it took hundreds of years. My late mother had a saying. She said, it took 500 years for us to get here. It'll take us another 500 years to get back to where we're supposed to be. So one of the changes was contact. And in the 1500s, I want to say 1532, and there were several papal bulls, but the one in particular that sticks in my mind is the instruction to the European monarchies to say, take lands where there are no people. So in other words, just go out there and take. Notice that people is in quotes. And again, changes, in quotes, the discovery of indigenous peoples in the Americas. And at first, indigenous peoples were not considered people. But then, again, referring to changes, Christianity could only be granted to human beings. So this word went back to the popes. Oh my goodness, they're not human beings? Well, we can't Christianize them. I've got an idea. Let's call them human beings. Now you can go and Christianize. So indigenous peoples came to be seen as human. And so there you have the image of the Christian cross. And again, if indigenous peoples were human beings, they could now be Christianized. And if they're Christianized, then they must be educated. So there you see a scroll of paper. Then the changes continue. If indigenous peoples must be educated, then the languages have to be outlawed. So the use of indigenous languages, customs, religions, lifeways were forbidden. And so you'll see in the chart there all of those major things that were kind of separated out from the circle. Again, traditional indigenous economic systems, political systems, social systems, environmentally responsible practices were forbidden. And this is what happened over time. So now, coming to the fast forward, again, how did indigenous people come to be homeless or precariously housed or housed in dangerous situations of domestic violence and violence against women? And it was most of it dispossession from our lands, dispossession from the 99.75% of the land that's still ours. Introduced diseases with little to no immunity to new diseases. So if you read your history text, you'll find out how smallpox spread and tuberculosis and all kinds of other diseases. Also, the Indian residential school system had a major impact on what happened to our society, as well as the Indian day school system. Add to that the 60s scoop, where in the 1950s and 60s, indigenous children were removed from their families, not one at a time, but whole families at a time. The artist who did this work, his name is Mark Seabrook. He's an Anishinaabe from Sagamok Anishinaabe. He was a 60s scoop survivor. So it wasn't just him, it was all of his siblings that were removed. And the removal of the children disrupted the family cycle, disrupted the clan, disrupted the community, disrupted the nation. And so now you have people walking around with PTSD because of all these things that happened. And then the later manifestation of it was murdered and missing indigenous women and girls. If you had a society that regards human beings as not human, then the depersonalization, the dehumanization is easy to do, as in kill 4 women and throw them in the dump in Winnipeg, you know? So part of truth and reconciliation begins with the truth. So the challenge and the question to you is, how much are you willing to learn about what really happened? What one truth can you take away today? And what truth can you share with other people that will help them understand this society that we're living in a whole lot better? So the learning has to do with human rights, Indigenous history, gender-based analysis, etc., etc. So we come to the now. What is going on now? What impacts, what affects it? The revelation of unmarked graves of children a year ago now. Those unmarked graves are still being uncovered. And the families that lost those children didn't have those children brought home to be buried properly or given funeral services properly. They're still dealing with that grief, that heartbreak, that sorrow, and they're recovering from that. And also the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Final Report, how many of those have been acted on? And the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Final Report, how many of those recommendations have been acted on? Seems to me I read something somewhere that 300 different times in that final report, housing is mentioned for Indigenous women and girls and gender diverse people. Then finally, there was the National Indigenous Housing Network's human rights claim launched at the same time in June 2022, along with the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network's human rights claim. Misa'eu, which means the end. Anyway, just a reference to Mark's work here. Mark Seabrook, he's a Anishinaabe from Sagmuk. And I will stop there. I know that, there's 1,000 other things I could mention. And I will leave it there for Q&A. And I thank you for your patience and understanding. Jimmy Wedge.
Thank you so much to Kaitlin and Marie for these incredible presentations.